name is Eduardo Marquez. I'm a professor of political science at the University of São Paulo and director of the Center for Metropolitan Studies. And I'm also one of the co-editors of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, IJRA. And it's with great pleasure that I chair and open this IJRA lecture with Professor Daniel Agbiboa. I think this will be a wonderful experience for you. I've read the papers, great. Professor Agbiboa is Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and previously was Assistant Professor at George Mason University and a postdoctoral fellow at University of Pennsylvania. He got his PhD in international development from the University of Oxford, and previously had a Master of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. I don't know if he has something with rowing, but this is the choices seem to suggest this. And Professor Agbiboa is a rising star in the discussions on states and non-state forms of authority, and the specialization and materialization of power in cities, power in politics in cities, especially in contemporary African cities. And he is the author of several books and articles on the topic. And it's really a pleasure to have this session. The lecture is called Government Magic on Urban Policing, Spectral Violence, and Transnational Solidarity. So I give you the floor. Thank you for your presence and lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here and to be presenting this IJRA lecture. A lot of the thought that went into this presentation happened during my sabbatical at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. And so I have many people to thank from Didier Fassin, Wendy Brown, and many others as well who were part of that cohort. Also, I want to thank the IJRA board, all the organizers of the conference for facilitating a smooth entry here. It's my first time in Santiago, Chile, in Chile more broadly. And so it's a delight to be able to be here. So today, I will present a topic on government magic, which is actually something that is taken from my favorite Nigerian musician, Fela Kuti, who in the early 1980s sang a song called Unknown Soldier. I'll talk more about that and use the word government magic. The presentation itself will go through 8 sections. So that gives you a sense of how I'm progressing. So I'll just delve into it then. Let's make sure this is working. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is this better? Okay, wonderful. Let's see if this works. Okay, wonderful. I can't breathe. These were the dying words of 42-year-old African-American George Perry Floyd Jr. as his life was snuffed out under the knee of now former Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin. Floyd was arrested after a store clerk suspected him of using a counterfeit $20 bill and alerted the police. His slow, agonizing death on May 25, 2020, recorded by a bystander, provoked massive protests that spilled over into cities across and beyond the United States. and reignited uneasy questions about the intersectionality of police brutality and anti-Black racism. The video of Floyd's murder sent shockwaves around the globe, generating indignation and unprecedented scrutiny, and nowhere as critically as in urban Africa. From Accra to Cape Town and Lagos to Nairobi, Africa-based demonstrations in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement were matched with strongly worded statements by African political leaders, including the chairperson of the African Union, denouncing the brazen murder of George Floyd and urging America to put an end to all forms of discrimination and negrophobia. The support for Black Lives Matter was not just embodied, but also divine. In Benin Republic, that West African nation, world famous for being the birthplace of voodoo, priests, priestesses, and diviners undertook a revenge ritual, invoking the god of iron, Badagli, to empower Floyd to rise in the spiritual world and to mete out punishment on his behalf. But as the saying goes, when you point a finger, there are three fingers pointing back at you. How can we express outrage over the death of Floyd, some Africans pointedly ask, but stay eerily silent on the brazen killings of African nationals by our own police? Others noted that Black Lives matter everywhere that Black lives are found, whether in the Twin Cities or in Kinshasa. Why, they ask, did the life of one Black man in the US attract more attention than the killing of Black people on the continent? Where was the mobilization of empathy and the outpouring of affective solidarity when during the enforcing of pandemic-related lockdown measures and cordon sanitaires in 2020, police institutions across Africa killed scores of people in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Uganda? Africa did not have to wait long after Floyd's murder to face its own reckoning with police brutality. On October 3, 2020, the continent's most populous country, Nigeria, was shaken by a massive youth-led campaign against police violence. Under the rallying hashtag #EndSARS, the Sorosoke, or Speak Up generation, as young protesters styled themselves, demanded to see an end to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS, an elite unit of the Nigerian police force initially established in 1992 as a nationwide response to an epidemic of armed robbery and kidnapping. Their voice belied the long-held criticism that Nigerians lacked the spirit to rise up and say no, encapsulated in that Nigerian portmanteau of the sit-down-look generation, combining sit down and look. The rise of the Sorosoke generation called that docile subjectivity into scrutiny, signaling the collective refusal of urban youth to normalize themselves according to the structures of power and moral economies that render them permanently vulnerable. Sorosoke became Nigeria's I Can't Breathe, and EndSARS became that country's Black Lives Matter. The immediate catalyst for EndSARS was an October 3, 2020 viral video that showed the apparently unprovoked killing of an unknown young man by SARS officers during a summary stop and frisk operation in the town of Ughelli in Delta State. After the killing, the police officers made away with the young man's SUV, leaving his ravaged corpse by the roadside. Soon after, another video surfaced on Twitter showing SARS officers killing the rising 28-year-old musician Daniel Chibuike just outside a supermarket in Port Harcourt, Rivers State. Nigerians had seen enough. On the other hand, the unknown SARS officers involved in these killings revealed the veil of secrecy, impunity, and passive loyalty that has long marked the Nigerian police force as a total institution. At the same time, it points to the spectral force that undergirds moments of astounding violence in Nigeria. Here, as in the US, the police investigate itself and answers to itself. On the other hand, the unknown identity of the young man from Ughelli symbolizes the cloak of anonymity and depersonalization that shrouds police victims in Nigeria. The lyrics from Nigerian musician Fela Kuti, his album Unknown Soldier ring true today. In Nigeria, he sang, I like the get, which is the pidgin English, but get is have. We get unknown police, we get unknown soldier, we get unknown civilian, all is equal to unknown government. The casual snuffing out of Black lives by the police in both America and Nigerian cities is a stark reminder of the proximity in disparate regions of Blackness to non-being and Black death to non-event. And yet, in these two countries, there seems to be a cruel optimism, a sort of unhopeful hope against all evidence that the police can be transfigured. At the same time, in both countries, the police appear to be suspended between two competing roles. On the one hand, the stated public service role of providing effective security to persons and property, and on the other, a post-colonial force for internal repression, applying force to keep the populace subjugated to the interests of a surplus-extracting elite. In this lecture, I bring into proximity two distant contexts, Nigeria and the US, in an attempt to elucidate the magic of the state, that is to say, its spectral power. I focus on incidents of police brutality and the popular movements of resistance and repair that have erupted to denounce and counter it. My transnational focus seeks to deprovincialize police brutality against Black youth by exploring the continuities that link the US and Nigeria together, while acknowledging their obvious differences. This lecture is a theoretical intervention that derives from a nagging worry about narratives of police brutality that remain trapped in the provincial, wedded to that Wittgenstein dictum, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. These atomized discourses at once essentialize the police and preclude a relational and deprovincialized mode of thinking about policing and police brutality. Linking the NSAS movement in Nigeria to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, two campaigns on either side of the Atlantic that, despite their geographical separation, nevertheless shared intimate characteristics. I want to argue that the popular focus on spectacular and highly mediatized features of police brutality conceals the far more ordinary act of police violence, which depend on unseen forces emanating from and beyond the state. The brutality of policing extends far beyond the occasional spectacular incidents caught on camera. By converging on the spectacle, we lose sight of the routine and structural nature of police violence, and in doing so, lose grounds for a truly transnational and fixed solidarity against police brutality. Now, more on the solidarity ahead, but let me first offer an orienting critique of an influential concept. Maybe it will change later. There you go. My analysis is both about and beyond necropolitics, a term popularized by the political theorist Achille Mbembe as a way of identifying those figures of sovereignty whose central project is the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies. While the concept of necropolitics has gained analytical purchase across the social sciences, especially urban politics, it remains under-theorized and over-dramatized and confines us to what Luis Althusser calls thinking at the extremities. To the extent that it trains our eyes on brutal and material destruction and centers on sovereign uses of spectacular violence, necropolitics is less capacious as a way of rediscovering the ordinary. That is to transcend the spectacle of police brutality, which constitute the burden of this lecture. Necropolitics too frequently boils down to life or death, with death cast as a fact that is separate from the administration of life processes. Yet the multitude fits awkwardly within this bifurcated world, to the extent that violence itself produces far more injuries than death. Then it would appear that our world has less to do with Mbembe's death world and more to do with how injuries are born in the register of the ordinary. The ordinary, Njabulo Ndebele tells us, is the opposite of the spectacular. The ordinary is sobering rationality. It is the forcing of attention on necessary detail. As state violence, police brutality persists in a subtle way, woven, as it were, into the minutiae of daily life. The very concept of police brutality trains our eyes on the explicit, the gruesome, the sensational, and the overtly violent aspects of policing, while leaving intact cruel systems and quiet encroachment, which are much harder to see and address because they operate spectrally, because they are embedded in what Vinodas calls the textures of the ordinary. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the main site of police brutality is that of ordinariness, such as outside a Memphis corner where George Floyd was asphyxiated, outside a Wendy's restaurant where Richard Brooks was fatally shot just weeks after Floyd's death, or at a traffic stop where Philando Castile was murdered in a hail of bullets. We confront the ordinary at a park near his home where Tamil Rice was shot and killed by a police officer, or in his grandmother's backyard where Stephen Clark was shot 6 times in the back by a Sacramento police officer. Ordinariness lurks in his father's Florida neighborhood where Trayvon Martin was fatally shot while walking home, and on his sofa at home eating ice cream where Botham Jean was shot and killed by off-duty officer Ampagaya. The ordinary is all around us, all day, every day. Less than a mile from his mother's house, where Tyle Nicole was mauled to death by 6 Memphis police officers. In the intimacy of her own very apartment, where Breonna Taylor was shot dead by Louisville officers. And just a few weeks ago, July 6th to be precise, the tragic case of African-American woman Sonia Massey, who was shot and killed in her own home by a responding Illinois officer after she called 911 for help. In Nigeria, as in the US, the infrastructure of ordinary routine life, including roadblocks, bus terminals, junctions, and roundabouts, constitutes the primary site of brutality and retaliatory extortion by poorly paid police officers, the so-called subalterns of the state. These ordinary, one might even call them liminal spaces, embody the contradictions of capitalist modernity, especially its inescapable enticement, its self-consuming passions, its discriminatory tactics, and its devastating social cost. As in the US, police brutality in Nigeria has an important class dimension. For instance, the primary targets of the Nigerian police are generally drawn from urban hellholes where people leak out of existence. These targets include road transport workers and their passengers, petty traders, students, mechanics, load carriers, and hairstylists. In the post-colonial Nigerian system, for instance, commercial taxi drivers endure the everyday kick and slap of the police. They are frequently extorted, harassed, and assaulted by police officers for refusing to pay bribes as low as $1. The ordinariness and therefore the taking for grantedness of police brutality reinforces the point that it is in everyday urban life that the spectacle of police brutality loses its exceptional character and begins to appear normal. This lecture refracts that ordinariness of police brutality through the prism of who gets locked into precarity and therefore locked outside the juridical order and protections of the state, effectively becoming police property. Like Sharon Patricia Holland, this lecture does not promise a reading of death that always focuses on the dead. Instead, it offers a discontinuous reading of death as a figurative silencing or process of erasure. Now, we live in a new media age that reduces believing to seeing and downplays the power of the strange and concealed in making sense of the familiar and visible. Invented in the early 19th century, the magic of the camera was thought to improve the public's kudai of hitherto classified police work, and hence to serve as a third eye of sort, one that produces a vision of urban policing that has been made either invisible or opaque to most of us, one that reveals what is generally concealed or simply ignored about policing. Simply put, the camera was touted as a technology that would allow ordinary citizens to see like the state. Yet it appears that magic has now become our undoing. For elite in particular, visibility has become a trap. The camera has occluded our capacity to see beyond what is present. It has prevented us from grasping the surplus of meaning that exists beyond what is present. That exists beyond, in Jacques Broncier's words, the truncheon blows of the forces of law and order. As Ndebele argues, the habit of looking at the spectacle has forced us to gloss over the nooks and crannies. Rather than bringing some clarity, the camera often obscures the underneath of things. The outcome is a world where the image is invested with more dignity than the original. In moments of police brutality, the camera leaves us with an inquest instead of a genealogy. What we see through the camera is the submersion of the subject in the spectacle, a submersion that heightens the distance from origin. No wonder then that Jacques Derrida describes the visibility of the camera as synonymous with a night visibility. This specter of Derrida's night visibility haunts and taunts the resolution in the US to equip police officers with body cameras in the wake of a grand jury's decision not to indict police officer Darren Wilson, who in 2014 shot and killed 18-year-old African-American man Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. In a passage worthy of copious quotation here, the writer Eric Antamartin explains, and it's worth reading. On December 1, amid the varying levels of response to the non-indictment of Officer Wilson, President Obama requested $236 million to invest in body cameras and police training to restore trust in policing. Right? 2 days later, a Staten Island grand jury decided not to indict Officer Daniel Pantaleo in the death of Eric Garner, an event that was caught on camera. Many, both liberal and conservative, clearly saw an injustice and an abuse of power. Others saw Garner resist, which in their mind justified the response by Pantaleo. Immediately, the solution of increasing cameras became problematic, if not farcical. Even the visual evidence was not enough to indict, belying an underlying systemic problem that shapes the way we see. Now, in his opening statement delivered in the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin, prosecuting attorney Jerry Blackwell, after showing the court the video clip of Floyd's murder, asked the court to, quote, "Believe your eyes that it's homicide, it's murder. You can believe your eyes." Persuasive as this was, we would need more than our eyes to truly fathom and subvert police brutality. After all, it was similar legal eyes that beheld the footage of Eric Garner's death on Staten Island and Rodney King's diabolical beating by Los Angeles police officers in 1991. In both instances, the accused police officers were not convicted. These examples point up the aporia of video as evidence, even as they make anti-Black police violence the cynosure of media eyes. As a much-touted technological solution to police brutality, the camera amounts to a fetishization of sight that evades the underlying problem, a problem that not only has to do with race and class, but also the very structures, technologies, and deployments of power in modern society. Nigerian musician Fela Kuti was right after all. The eyes alone cannot grasp government magic. He should know. On February 18, 1977, his Kalakuta Republic commune was ransacked and razed by state security forces. Why? Because he had dared to speak up to Sorosuke against the corruption and excesses of the military junta. During the raid, Fela's 77-year-old mother, Fumilayo Kuti, a renowned fighter for women's rights, was thrown from the window of a second-story building and later died from her injuries. A government investigation into the attack claimed the raid was conducted by quote-unquote unknown soldiers. 10 years later, Fela released his album called Unknown Soldier, in which he described the aftermath of the Kalakuta attack as government magic, categorizing the police, army, and court as instruments of that magic. He bellowed in agony. What kind of injustice is this? I prefer the pidgin. Which kind of injustice is this? Most incidences of officer-involved brutality and murder in Nigeria and the US go unprosecuted, due in large part to the status of the police as incarnations of the sovereign right to kill, indeed as instruments of government magic. This magic is best conjured by the contentious doctrine of sovereign immunity in Nigeria and qualified immunity in the US. The digital age may have transformed the police into what Nicholas Mezuev calls a visual subject, one whose existence is defined by the axiom, I am seeing and I see that I am seeing. But the police forces seem undeterred by this. Why? First, because when confronted with a video, the police usually have a version that seeks not necessarily to contradict what you see, but to explain it. Second, because like the ancient Roman figure of Homo Caesar, police officers enjoy certain immunity to law precisely because they are configured as existing outside or prior to the law. In his novel, Arrow of God, the late Nigerian author Chinua Achebe proverbially sums up police impunity, and I quote, "When we see a little bird dancing in the middle of the pathway, we must know that its drummer is in the nearby bush." End of quote. In Nigeria, people extrajudicially killed by the police are often dehumanized as armed robbers who were shot dead while trying to escape, somehow implying that brutal policing can be enacted through a simulacrum of danger and order. Since the apogee of armed robbery cases in Nigeria in the 1980s, armed robbery has recurred ad nauseum in police rationalization of unlawful killings. In the US inner cities, by comparison, high crime rates often permit the police to exercise brutality with impunity in the name of civilization. American police authorities and prosecutors regularly draw on that hidden transcript about Black people as drug addicts to explain away murder. Prosecutors justify the killing of Michael Brown by arguing that the marijuana found in his system had caused him to become violent, despite refutations by medical experts. Officer Geronimo Yanes, who fatally shot Philando Castile, claimed that the smell of marijuana made him, quote unquote, fear for his life. The cops who ganged up on George Floyd reported that he, quote unquote, appeared to be under the influence. In both Nigeria and the US, lethal labels such as armed robbers, area boys, bloody civilians, drug users, crack murderers, and potheads sustain highly visible police violence against criminalized and suspected communities. These labels constitute a spectral form of violence on top of which overt forms of violence could be stacked. Labels register a popular patterning that blames the disadvantaged for their misery, implying that these subalterns deserve whatever brutal punishments come their way. In this way, the police justify rage and legitimize visible forms of violence as necessary evil. The lumping and labeling of certain groups as armed robbers or drug addicts by police and prosecutors amplify and solidify their non-status as criminals or could-be criminals, eclipsing their complex personhood and status as rights-bearing citizens. The gross violations of human rights by the Nigerian police, including the special police units such as SARS, has earned them the public nickname, quote unquote, kill and go, for their tendency to gun down innocent civilians and simply get off scot-free. This modus operandi of kill and go applies seamlessly to the US. Out of nearly 2,000 police killings of Black people from 2013 through 2019, charges were brought against police officers in just 3% of cases, and fewer than 1% of the killings reached a conviction. One of the striking things about the murder of George Floyd was not so much the singularly casual and brutal kneeling on his neck by police officer Derek Chauvin, as the easily overlooked reaction of two concerned bystanders. One placed a call to 911 to report that he believed he had just witnessed an officer-involved murder. He would later testify, and I quote, "I felt the need to call the police on the police." The other one pleaded with a clearly panicked Floyd to submit to the officers, warning him, "Bro, you can't win." These voices from the margins reveal public perception of the police as endowed with what Michel Foucault describes as the instrument of permanent, exhaustive, omnipresent surveillance, capable of making all visible as long as it could remain itself invisible. The side comments, "You can't win," reveal a consciousness of the invisible, visible powers that lie underneath the enactment of police brutality and render it indemnifiable. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has argued that the state's grip is most palpable in the realm of symbolic production, a realm which in his perspective constitutes the habitus of, quote unquote, the most brutal relations of force. If the police are the quintessential symbol of the state, indeed the most practical expression of government policy, then it appears we have become fixated on the symbol and lost sight of what it gestures to us. Beyond the episodic spectacles, police brutality embodies a spectral state, one that is simultaneously potent and without boundaries, decentered and centralizing, without agency, yet capable of tremendous economic, political, and ecological effect. To pose the problem of police brutality as an exception, for instance, the proverbial few rotten apples often adduced by police authority, or as a rule, for instance, as a matter of institutional decay, is to leave virtually untouched the invisible political and economic forces that have shadowed police integrity ab initio. Police brutality may be instantly visible and corporeal, but it is vacuous except in association with a state that is ever more captured and legitimized by capital, ever more bound by the social contract. In moments of spectacular violence, such as the murder of George Floyd, the popular reaction is less systemic than knee-jerk, all right? Angling a desperate gaze down at the police force and demanding concrete and common sense reform. It is as though the overpowering horror of that real violence, combined with the empathy for the brutalized, prevents us from seeing beyond this subjective violence with a clearly identifiable actor and victim. And yet, as the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty insists, the proper essence of the visible is to have a layer of invisibility in its strictest sense, which it makes present as a certain absence. By decomposing and rectifying and reifying the police as a singular body, removed from the social body and the field of power, we unwittingly let the state off the hook. We sustain the ghost-like capacity of the state to pass time and again as an ally of the brutalized, when in effect it is the brutalizer in chief. In this, the magic of the state mirrors the city as a witch, capable, as Abdulmalik Simon tells us, of being the curse and the cure. The tendency to focus on overt and fantastic aspects of policing produces a familiar spirality in which cases of spectacular police violence spark spasmodic on- and offline outrage against the police, which then gives way to animated demands for concrete police reforms. When that interval in time fades, society returns to the starting point, which may be described as a point of forbearance and resilience, with little progress towards redress. Treating police brutality as if it existed in a vacuum, as if it were dissociable from or independent of the different phases of power, produces what I call pseudo-urgency and pseudo-reform. By pseudo-urgency, I mean theatrical acts that really stray far from piecemeal expressions of localized shock and awe. But people in the suspect communities, such as African Americans and young Nigerians, are really shocked by acts of police brutality. In fact, they expect it and prepare for it. By pseudo-reform, I mean bureaucratic remedies and technocratic actions, such as better police training, restructuring police wages, more oversight of the police, use of body cameras, and a ban on chokeholds, and the list continues. The kind that feigns ignorance about the deeper, unspoken, and even unspeakable truth about police brutality and government magic. Combined, pseudo-urgency and pseudo-reform lead us down the path of what the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek calls fetishistic disavowal, in which people in power know that police brutality is systemic, but remain agnostic about the ramifications of this knowledge so that it could, quote unquote, continue acting as if it doesn't know. Little wonder then that Lawrence Raab concludes in his foreign affairs essay that, quote, police departments in the US appear to be immune to reform. This realization has prompted anti-police brutality movements such as Black Lives Matter to abandon calls for police reform in favor of defunding or abolishing police departments altogether. While technocratic reforms and changes in police leadership have been used to ameliorate growing popular angst around police impunity, these changes hardly counteract the more spectral forces that authorize and indemnify brutality. In light of these, contemporary police reforms may be reconfigured as formed within what the anthropologist Anna Singh calls a gap. That is, zones of erasure and incomprehensibility. Gaps occur where police reform projects do not reach so far or deep as to change everything according to their plans. In essence, it is far easier to enact technocratic reforms than to address the social, legal, and political economic structure in which the brutalization of non-incorporated subjects is normalized and goes unpunished. This, the reluctance to attend to the underneath of police brutality, is why the police reform agenda remains feckless, with its goal or its real aim not so much to transform as to perform and pacify. The frequency with which police reforms are evoked in the US and Nigeria, that is brought into existence so that they can be effaced, inscribe them within the logic of a spectre. By way of illustration, in the US, Senate members have thus far failed to agree on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2021, despite the fact that the reform bill, which passed in the US House of Rep, has been touted as, quote, bold, comprehensive approach to addressing police brutality. Among other provisions, the act would have held local and state police officers who commit misconduct accountable by restricting the application of the qualified immunity doctrine. In Nigeria, now former President Muhammadu Buhari responded to youth demands to end SARS by unveiling a new police squad known as the Special Weapons and Tactics Team, SWAT, without any evidence of substantial reform. NSAS protesters were not fooled by the name change, noting that SWAT is just a new name for an old practice, and that previous pledges to reform the Nigerian police force has so far failed to materialize. Of course, this skepticism is not unfounded. Since 2017, the Nigerian government has announced the dissolution of SARS no less than 4 times. This is why Nigerian sociologist Ebenezer Obadare insists that any policy reform must consider the way in which the travels of the police and policing are a mere expression of larger problems inherent in the structure of the Nigerian state. To remake the police after our heart's desire, we must better ourselves at exposing the strategies of concealment that too often thrust police officers to the sphere of unknowability and impunity, ensuring that police actions are felt but not disciplined. We must dismantle the safety that for too long have resided in the pretense of invisibility and in the regime of pretense. We must improve at demystifying spectral forces such as those that fund police work and prisons at the expense of public schools and hospitals, or those that facilitate death-inducing practices by multinational corporations to the detriment of local communities on the edge, whose at-risk residents are condemned to living abject lives and dying premature death. Simply put, we must reconsider policing as what I call spectral violence. Only by doing so can we hope to forge towards what Rosen Liu and Savannah Shange calls thick solidarity. That is a kind of solidarity that mobilizes empathy in ways that do not gloss over difference, but rather pushes into the specificity, irreducibility, and incommensurability of racialized experiences. A product of ambivalent state effects. Spectral violence describes a violence that is at once here and elsewhere, a violence that hides in plain sight and appears in disguise. In spectral violence, we are dealing with a violence that is tangible and visible, yet secret and distant. In other words, a violence that insists with great profit without properly existing and disappears as quickly as it is evoked. Central to spectral violence is the haunting shadow of the spectre itself, a trace that Derrida tells us marks the present with its absence in advance. Spectral violence makes salient what might otherwise remain obscure and barely discernible about policing. The spectral illumines the spectacular, just like the shadow illumines the subject. As George Simmel reminds us, secrecy secures the possibility of a second world alongside the obvious world, and the latter is most strenuously affected by the former. While we now feel a sense of familiarity with that horrifying spectacle called police brutality, we still know remarkably little about the problem with the problem, partly because of the veil of secrecy over police matters. Spectral violence recognizes that the terrible spectacle of police brutality against which suspect communities often mobilize in their demand for justice and change remains the mask behind which banal terrorism takes effect. In short, spectral violence recognizes that the most insidious forms of state violence are not gory, they are ghostly. Recasting the terrible spectacle of police brutality in a spectral light activates the work of deprovincialization by tracking the ghost-like effect of state violence across vast and multiple interacting spaces. In the one, crime that naturalizes certain social categories as criminals and would-be delinquents. In the jail system that marks the primary invisible ground upon which the visible personality of society is made possible. In the simultaneous embodiment of order and its unraveling, of promise and of nightmare that underlies the fetishization of police. In the prison and oil industrial complexes that make visible the intertwining networks of capitalism, globalization, and corporations. In the qualified immunity that makes it virtually impossible for the public to hold public police officers accountable for wrongdoing. In the surplus extracting elites and crony capitalists who eat the sweat of the bottom billion. In the unheard plight of Black women such as Ifeoma Abugu and Omobolanle Rahim from Nigeria, and Breonna Taylor and Sonia Massey from the US, whose violent death at the hands of the police do not quite rise up to grievable and protestable human death. In non-incorporated queer bodies who are displaced and freighted with fearful fantasies. In global neoliberal capitalism, complete with its new urban fantasies of smart cities, eco cities, and world-class cities, all of which undo the viability of many lives and livelihoods. And finally, in efforts by the Nigerian and US government to systematically discredit anti-police brutality protests by protesters by labeling them, in the case of Nigeria, misbehaving youth and subversive elements, and in the US, thugs and symbols of hate. From Black Lives Matter to NSAS, contemporary social movements against police brutality are more than instant reaction to spectacular police killings. Rather, they are campaigns against spectral violence that dare to envision a different possibility of being in the world beyond the settled social order. The very decentralized nature, in other words, the structurelessness and leaderlessness of these movements mirrored spectral forces and opaque processes against which they fight. These movements recognize that Blackness itself has become more diverse in its manifestation, and that the non-reducibility of Blackness to racial category establishes a basis from which to launch a new form of planetary consciousness and planetary politics, one of repair and collaborative survival. Urban social movements against police brutality understand that the spectacle of police violence is ultimately a form of camouflage. It does not so much conceal as render unrecognizable. True, the Black Lives Matter movement first mobilized in 2012 in response to the murder of African-American teenager Trayvon Martin by a rent-a-cop. And the NSAS movement in Nigeria first trended in 2017 on the heels of a police-involved murder that went viral. Yet, soon after, both campaigns recalibrated their protest agendas by refracting these high-profile cases of police brutality through what the historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham calls a meta-language, which she defines as a fluid set of overlapping and dialogic discourses, and as a global sign that gives power to a host of expressions and to myriad aspects of life. That meta-language was on full display in Nigeria when protests to end SARS and end police brutality soon morphed into wider demands to end bad governance, end corruption, stop killing our youth, and end state violence. Similarly, following the killing of Trayvon Martin, Black Lives Matter visibly sought to reconfigure spectacular cases of police brutality as symptoms of structural injustices and social ills that are spectral in nature, such as the deep disparities baked into housing, public education, justice, and healthcare systems. Black Lives Matter activists questioned why in Black populated cities the police are prioritized over public policy, and prisons over public schools. They sought to tie the African-American struggle with violent modes of extraction, enclosures, and foreclosed futures, as well as with the global struggle for Black freedom to be, to do. The point then is this: the aforesaid illustrations reflect efforts by social movement to transform graphic cases of police brutality into a meta-language by inscribing, among other things, police, machista, state, racial capitalism, ecology, epidemiology within the same episteme. What we see in this anti-brutality movement, from Black Lives Matter to NSAS and even the new Menos in this part of the world, is how spectacular moments of violence morphed into broader movement against neoliberalism, which, according to political theorists Wendy Brown, furnishes, and I quote, the rationality through which capitalism finally swallows humanity. In this penultimate section, I want to shed light onto the spectral violence inflicted on that category of non-incorporated persons that I call the unpeople, by which I mean criminalized subjects who are stripped of all social and legal marks and therefore encrypted in social, civil, and literal death. In the US, African Americans represent the social category of the unpeople, as borne out by first, the war on crime, and then the war on drugs. Young Black men in particular became the opium of America's lavish war on drugs, whose Pyrrhic victory is marked by the contemporary atrocity of mass incarceration. And while the criminal spotlight has historically been on Black men, the plight and agency of Black women too often slips under the radar, rendering them invisible and less important in comparison to their similarly situated male counterparts. Their socioeconomic non-status notwithstanding, African Americans have a higher chance of incarceration than any other racial group. This welding of race and prison, I argue, adheres to the logic of spectral violence. As the diary of President Nixon's former White House chief of staff reveals, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the Blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. That organizing spectral logic typifies what anthropologist Teresa Caldera calls the talk of crime. A talk which feeds a circle in which fear is both dealt with and reproduced, and violence is both counteracted and magnified. Put differently, a critical quality of the talk of crime is the oscillation between the real and the imaginary realized and the real imagined. The talk of crime in America today not only amounts to symbolic violence, but also produces police fetishism, which celebrates police violence as necessary to control the criminal chaos and decay of everyday urban life. In the self-fulfilling nature of America's war on crime and talk of crime, crime itself has become racialized and race criminalized, and both, for lack of better terms, at once euthanized. In Nigeria, on the other hand, youth constitutes the main category of the unpeople, as borne out by the youth-biased official campaign against cybercrime. The Nigerian government homogenizes youth as downright criminals or would-be delinquent, and many are debased and humiliated on the move. The meaning of youth has become so co-opted by criminality in Nigeria that it is almost impossible to think of one without the other. Today, the social category of youth in Nigeria has become a synonym for Yahoo Boy and 419, both Nigerian vernaculars for fraudsters. These vernaculars firmly entrench youth within the deceptive world and counterfeit modernity of Nigerian spectacle, one that blurs the boundaries between signifier and signified, between the fetish and the fake. Ultimately, these vernaculars of youth as fraud reclaim the magic through which post-colonial urbanism is built upon duplicitous illusions and the magical allure of making money from nothing. The image of youth as fraud has bled into the global arena in form of the Nigerian Prince scam. The issue is well put by these NSAS protesters. Young, not criminal, but not criminal. Starting in the early 2000s, the naturalization of Nigerian youth as fraudsters became a leitmotif of SARS' ruthless war on cybercrime.
On the basis of their appearance and body language, armed SARS officers would accost, shake down, seize, and attack the sense of self of young Nigerians. For these youth, policing is not simply a part of their lives, it has become a condition of life. Similar to the experience of the so-called disorderly people from the low-income neighborhoods here in Santiago, the daily lives of young Nigerians are shaped by and indeed constituted through policing. SARS officers seldom wear uniforms, thereby blurring the lines between crime fighters and criminals. Their usual targets are urban youth with locks, dyed hair, ripped jeans, earrings, tattoos, iPhones, laptops, or flashy cars. These youths are forced to assume the status of an at-will citizen, allowed autonomy only at the discretion of the officer. SARS victims who cannot afford to buy their bail are often held incommunicado in overcrowded police cells, with bail is free and the police is your friend stickers emblazoned on the walls. In that non-place, where seized bodies fall outside the legal purview, youth are stripped, tortured, murdered, and cast away. The banality of police violence in Nigeria today is most striking in the most unusual sight of dead bodies in a river or by a highway, reminding people that no one is safe, that the organizing logic of the Nigerian state is impunity. In 2013, SARS officers in Southeast Nigeria killed 35 young men and dumped their bodies into the Ezu River, contaminating a vital source of water and worship for the local Amsia community. To behold these silent and silenced bodies, this unspeaking and unspeakable violence is to encounter the omnivorous potentiality and spectral power of the post-colony itself. This is the final section. By spectacularizing police brutality through the eyes of the US and Nigeria, two countries that rarely share the same stage, my goal in this lecture is not to flatten the distinctions between both contexts. On the contrary, it is to show that there is more that unites these contexts than divides them. In this manner, I hope to provoke a truly transnational solidarity against police brutality. By solidarity, I neither assume that the struggles of Black Lives Matter and End SARS are the same, nor that their ideals and slogans map onto the same urban reality in the respective context. Rather, my aim is to show how our entangled life worlds in routine encounters with police brutality compel thick solidarity, which involves walking across rather than glossing over difference. Thick solidarity here underscores the need for an intersubjective awareness and affective connectivity that insists upon the inherent value of each other's lives, despite never being able to fully understand or fully share in the experience of those lives. My Nigerian friends are often quick to insist that NSAS was not strongly influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. And this was following the killing of George Floyd. They are not unfounded fear being that American centricism or Americentrism will ensure that the voice and agency of NSAS youth will be totally eclipsed by the more prominent and dominant Black Lives Matter movement. So they are keen to separate them. And yet, the image of the body of a Black man on the streets of Minneapolis cannot be visually or viscerally disconnected from that of another Black man whose freshly ravaged corpse lie by the roadside on the other side of the Atlantic. Nor can it be lost on us that the police had a hand in both death and in these foreclosed futures. While we may not have the same lives or share the same feelings or even bodies, we do draw collective breath. And it is this breath in common that allows us to fold each other in without being subsumed, that at once summons us into being and being with each other. I am because you are. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. It was really strong. We have some 21 minutes still. so we can get some questions. I have some here, but I'm not going to use my agenda setting prerogatives up front. So if someone wants to start, otherwise I start. Please say just so we don't have much time. So please, your name, institution, and a short question.
So I know that the police reform is not the center of your talk, but I was thinking of the importance of understanding bureaucratic discretion. I don't know if this is too far from the talk. The ability of the police to choose to be violent, to choose to do you know, in a difficult situation, in a complex situation, to choose to refrain from violence or to participate in violence. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for your talk, Daniel. So just quickly, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you relate to abolitionist perspectives, police abolition and prison abolition. Yeah, because sorry, my name is Gabriela. I'm from the University of São Paulo. I'm a PhD student. And we have been debating this there because there are lots of policies, police reform policies that try to really mix policing with social assistance and, you know, turning police violence into something that is, well, less and less visible and more, you know, so really like people from the community being engaged with police work. So even the difference between police and, you know, the general population gets blurred. So if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you, Daniel. My name is Nama and I'm from the University of New South Wales. My question is about the kind of urban context. I guess it's implicit, I think, in the talk, that there is a spatiality to this, but I was wondering if you could bring it a little bit more intentionally into these kind of layers of, you know, analysis that you proposed. And thank you, that was mind-blowing.
Yes, absolutely. So the first point about bureaucratic attention to try to understand police officers as quote unquote subalterns of the state. So people who are also in a difficult position. And we see that filter through Black Lives Matter and answers in the sense that while there was a call from Black Lives Matter for defunding the police, for the answers youth, it was the opposite. It was actually a call to fund the police and to create better structures for the policing, which is really itself interesting to study. Well, I think it speaks to the discretion you're talking about there. In terms of the abolition and where I stand is similar to where people in the Twin Cities in the US stand. So right after the death of George Floyd, there was a movement, a bottom-up movement to replace police with other departments of self-care, public health, and the like. But when the result came out, it was voted down by mostly Black communities. And
And their argument was really interesting. Not that they don't want, not that they want to continue in a state of police brutality, but that they would not accept a half-baked planning that has not been well thought out. So the demand for intentional work rather than just a quick replacement. And so it's a call for moving beyond what Fanon calls intellectual laziness, to really innovate and be creative, come up and not just say, oh, we're going to replace. And that's where I start. And that's why it was very striking that it was Black communities predominantly that voted down that bill. On the urban context, over time, and I grew up in Lagos, the urban for me has become so interwoven with the everyday that when I talk about the everyday, the ordinary, I also talk about the urban. It's impossible for me to disconnect them. And so when you hear every time that I echo, police brutality itself, to despectacularize police brutality itself requires an intimate connection with the everyday, with the ordinary, which is the urban itself. And when you grasp that, then you begin to understand the relationship of what, Rifke Jaffe has always talked about, the relationship between the urban and the political and how they are intimately linked. It's also that relationship between the everyday. So I think the urban is really the underneath of things, but not in a passive way, right? But in an active way. And so for me, in that sense, the everyday has always been, for me, what the urban is.
Hi, I was wondering, how do you engage with the literature of Black feminism? I think it's wonderful and amazing that, in discussing the case of the United States, you include women or female presenting bodies, right? But I was wondering how that translates into the context of Nigeria. In the US, you have very prominent scholars like Angela Davis, and in Nigeria, you have Chimamanda Ngozi, right? So I was wondering if you engage with them, and if so, how?
Yes, absolutely. And that's an excellent point, because I think in many ways, the literature on Black feminism is the one that everybody plagiarizes and nobody acknowledges, unfortunately. They have contributed significantly to the epistemology that we are all using, but that we never really recognize. So it's to try to bring that to the fore, whether that is Saidiya Hartman's invitation to reconstruct the spectral violence, really, the violence that cannot be accounted for because the archives are silent, right? Or they don't exist. And many of you know this when you go to study these complex problems, that they're just not there. You have to reconstruct them. And that turn is a turn inward, and she's helped me to think with it. Chimamanda Adichie herself has also helped me in an opposite way, because part of my critique, admiration and critique is how it's important not to have a single story, but it's also important not to be the single story. So she's allowed me to hold both of them in precarious balance, and this applies to me as well. There's a sort of, especially in some of these elite universities in the US, there's sort of a clamoring for stars and a celebration. And when it comes to Black stars, there can only be, the world only has space for one at a time. So I'm trying not to, so the puzzle I have is, how do I attack the spectacularization without reproducing it? Unfortunately, I haven't figured out how. Well, thank you.
Hi, Daniel. Brilliant lecture. Nicolás Valenzuela from Universidad Técnica Federico Santa Maria here from Chile. You have spent quite a lot of time in academic institutions in the UK. So I wonder, you are familiar with Prevent. And I study unwritten institutions, unwritten rules in transport, and I've always been amazed of this message in British transport of, if you see something that doesn't look right, report it to the transport police, see it, say it, sorted, right? All the time, all the time, all the time. Here in Chile, we have the name we call frog, sapo, to people that it's all the time vigilating you, observing you. I was wondering, what do you think about those softer forms of policing? I remember these years of Black Lives Matter and later Me Too were also years of debating trigger warnings and safe spaces and wokeism and academic freedom. And I remember being in a debate in the UK, and it was like, are we not going to talk about prevent and the instructions that our professors have if we behave in a certain manner? So what do you think about those forms of softer policing? Thank you.
Neoliberalism, capitalism, various kinds of stereotypical categories. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So just wondering what lies behind this spectral that can't be seen. And you named various things: neoliberalism, capitalism, various kinds of stereotypes, categories, racism, obviously working differently across the US and Nigeria, post-colonial state power, the emergent assumptions of the actors, the police, the institutions, the specific institutions. Just wonder, are those tied up too closely when it's a spectrality that is something we don't see? It's a magic, but actually there's something there. There's presidents and people in rooms making decisions in different institutions and all kinds of stuff. So just wondering how you manage that to bring the spectral into a more sociological story. Yeah, thanks. But wonderful lecture.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I'm George from Binghamton University in the States. Just wanted to hear you elaborate on 2 points that I think you've touched on and have already been discussed in a couple questions. One is the sort of the utility of the spectral in forming solidarities, right? Because it has been instrumentalized in a certain way, especially in the States, to serve, to galvanize, to organize communities. The other one is beyond obfuscating the sort of everyday violence, how these reforms entrench violence within the system and cause us to lose sight of the origins or the roots of policing, right, to protect capital and the state, right? There's a similar argument being made recently over how the focus on, for example, human rights discourse has moved us away from abolishing or being anti-war, right, to normalizing and humanizing war, right? So I see that similarly within the debates around abolition and policing, although we were, a couple of centuries removed from the start of policing, right? But I think we've kind of come to normalize that in certain programs like Prevent or see something, say something in the States, right? Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that ties in quite well with the first point on the whole thing of, if you see something, say something. And I know this because I've worked in this sort of non-DC like terrorism space, more critical terrorism space, and that is that dialectics of seeing, which is funny because those who are seeing are both a risk, but at risk as well. And so there's that always tension between the two. But I think, to connect it to the last point, what it does is precisely that it assumes that there's a neutrality or an objectivity about seeing. That you can objectively see something and you call it security. But what if you overlay that with racism, ethnicity, and all of these histories is it possible really to see something and say something? And so I think part of what I was questioning was really this idea that if we just see it, then we should say it. But how that itself can reproduce insecurity, depending on who do you see that is a criminal? You know, is it somebody on the hood that is the criminal? So those are questions I have with those kind of programs, because each time they move us into the more simplistic aspect that don't really grasp the underneath of what's going on. The underneath of what's going on with the second point, is there a there? I don't know. Maybe it's this fetishization that there is a there. Maybe there is nothing. But maybe it's just the thinking that there is something that is enough. That is the state effect itself, right? That produces that power. And to the extent that at least the everyday people that I work with always tell me that there's something untoward. There's a there happening. And to that extent, I believe them. I take them seriously. And they are the spectral agents. These commercial bus drivers in African cities, they will tell you, if you sit down with them over beer, they'll tell you there is a there that is happening. What do they mean there? And sometimes and then you say, tell me about it, and they explain, you know, experiences, how they've been treated, and those likes. So I think there is a spectral power in that in city life, and we see it when we talk to ordinary practitioners in these cities. The question, the final point on reform and human rights. It's interesting, human rights. African philosophy has contributed more to human rights than any other line of thinking, because African philosophy gave us the notion of personhood, but of course, again, unacknowledged. But what it means is that, but that personhood, what it is was a complex kind of personhood, a one that appreciates that we have to move beyond these softer approaches of seeing, one that appreciates that there are politics that are irreconcilable, there are politics that are in tension, one that holds things in sort of a creative balance. But unfortunately, the language of human rights too often is depoliticized and refuses to deal with awkwardness. It's too clean, it's too neat, it's too straightforward, and sometimes makes it uninteresting for me to engage with, because it doesn't have the color that was part of the African notion of personhood that underpins what human rights is. So I think that goes back to your point as well, that there's a complexity that I think social movement today now are leading the way in bringing that awkwardness to the fore and inviting us to deal with it. And I think if we really deal with it, then we'll be sitting uncomfortably in questions of racism and power and gender and all of these issues, which sometimes we don't want to look at. And so we sort of lump it under the neat language of human rights. Yes.
Short question. Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciated the talk. My name is Sophia, and I'm from the University of Essex. I work on Pakistani cities and everyday insecurity in relation to them. I wondered how you could think about the spectral and how it relates to the publics of policing, especially in the differences that we see between the US and Nigeria. And I say that because I wonder if there's any difference in the way that Blackness and servitude come into play in the Nigerian context more than sort of, racism per se. And whether there's any difference between the victims and what becomes spectacular as well. Because you mentioned the victim in Nigeria was someone who was killed out of an SUV, and George Floyd is an entirely different person and position hit. So if you could respond to that, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Daniel. I'm Jean Pouady from Georgia State University. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about what you see as the temporalities of government magic and how we might build solidarities against it. I think this is discussions of the spectacular see something, say something compels a particular mobilization of time.
but I think what you're kind of pointing to is kind of slower forms and long durations of violence. And how does that connect to building kind of thick solidarity? What timeframes or temporalities might we need to think about to build these types of connections between and across place? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's a whole aspect that I cut out of the talk, which is a more historical aspect where I'm looking at precisely that point about Blackness and how it lands in the US and in Nigeria. And again, my Nigerian friends are always quick to tell me, oh no, here we're not dealing with racism. You know, we're dealing with other things other racism. And even prominent writers like Chimamanda Adichie, right, have said that they only were conscious of their Blackness when they came to the US. I think that's just nonsense, really. I think so. I think you know, racism and colonialism dance to the same tune of exploitation. And this sense of trying to decouple them doesn't make sense. I think racism already was embedded and baked into colonialism. And you can see the way in which, when I give the instance of just walking and having a dead body by the side of the roadside, what is that sense of a lack of empathy with each other, lack of recognition of each other's humanity? What does that mean if not already embedded within the way in which we see each other and with the way in which we relate to each other? And I think it only creates and prevents, to go to the second point, it prevents us from fixed solidarity, in the sense that then you have Nigerians who are less willing to support what is going on in South Africa because they sort of are not, or in North Africa because they are not really Black. I think the turn should be the turn to empathy and the turn to the affective. And I think that's how we overcome these notions of Blackness, and even go beyond Nigeria or Black populated country to think about Blackness itself as evident in many parts of the world today, and the way in which in that sort of metaphorical way as well, Blackness is present all around us. So I think there's opportunity here for us to move and embrace those concepts. And I think really I don't buy the argument that I only become conscious of my Blackness when I came to the UK or the US. Temporalities also is so important. I recall, I don't know how many people recall before 9/11 happened, how the airports were, and after 9/11. It's like night and day, right? You know, you don't have the police dogs, you didn't have the TSA, the Transport Security Administration. All of those things changed after 9/11, and the kind of spectacular responses. And those responses itself produced a lot of harm, because in a subtle way, right? You ask the Muslim community, you fund Muslim communities and ask them to create programs of moderation, but in that same stroke, you're making them you're putting the spotlight on them in a negative light. So I'm thinking about, if we're to form fixed solidarity, it's not what happens during those spectacular moments, it's what happened in between. That time that I said in the talk of forbearance and resilience, which is always, you know, what the state invites us to do in between. That's where the fixed solidarity work. Do we tire out? Do we fade out? Do we lose stamina? How do we sustain that work, which is often underneath, going on quietly? I think that would be the decisive factor there in between the spectacular moments, what goes on. And there's a lot going on, and we need more research to uncover what is that work that is going on often in these spaces.
Thanks a lot. So we are closing the session. Thank you.